You may think your tomato plants are doing just fine because they are green and full of leaves. But if you keep making the same 5 mistakes that most gardeners make every single summer, you can easily lose more than half of the tomatoes you should have harvested. I have seen people blame the weather, the seeds, or even bad luck when the real problem was something they did with their own hands without even realizing it. That is exactly why I wanted to sit down with you today, because I have made every one of these mistakes myself over the years, and I know how disappointing it feels to wait for months only to pick a few small tomatoes while someone nearby fills basket after basket from the same size garden. The good news is that none of these mistakes require expensive products, fancy equipment, or complicated gardening tricks to fix. Most of the old gardeners I learned from never spent much money at all. They simply paid attention to a few simple habits that many people have forgotten today, and those habits made all the difference when harvest time arrived. I still remember one old neighbor who never rushed when working around his tomatoes. He would quietly look at every plant every morning, and somehow he always seemed to know what the plants needed before any serious problem appeared. At the time, I thought he had some special gift, but years later I realized he was simply avoiding the same mistakes that almost everyone else kept repeating. That is exactly what I want to share with you today, because once you understand these 5 common mistakes, you will start looking at your tomato plants in a completely different way. You will notice little signs that most people walk right past, and you will know how to fix small problems before they turn into lost fruit. Some of these mistakes happen before the first tomato even appears, while others quietly reduce your harvest week after week without you noticing until the season is almost over. The first mistake is probably the most common one of all, and I still see experienced gardeners making it every single year. Once you notice it, you may never look at your tomato plants the same way again. The first mistake is watering your tomatoes the way most people have been taught for years. I know it sounds strange because everyone says tomatoes need plenty of water, and that part is true, but very few people stop to think about how that water actually reaches the roots. I used to stand there with a hose spraying around the plants almost every evening because the soil looked dry on the surface. The leaves stayed green for a while, so I thought I was doing everything right, but when harvest came, the fruits cracked, some stayed small, and others simply stopped growing. Then an older gardener smiled and told me something I never forgot. He said, "Stop watering the ground that you can see, and start watering the roots that you cannot see." At first, I did not understand what he meant, but he showed me a simple old method that cost almost nothing. He buried an old plastic flower pot with several small holes drilled in the sides right beside each tomato plant. Every time he watered, he poured the water into that pot instead of pouring it across the soil. The water slowly moved deep underground, exactly where the roots needed it, instead of disappearing into the hot air or running away across the surface. It looked almost too simple to make any difference, but after trying it myself, I never went back to the old way. My plants stopped suffering during the hottest weeks of summer, and the fruits became larger, firmer, and much more even. Very few people still use this method today, even though it saves water, saves time, and helps the roots grow much deeper. Another mistake that often comes together with poor watering is getting the leaves wet every evening. Most people think they are helping the whole plant, but they are actually creating perfect conditions for disease. Wet leaves staying damp through the night can invite problems that slowly spread across the plant before you even notice them. I always try to keep the water low near the roots and let the leaves stay dry whenever possible. It is such a small habit that many people ignore, yet it can save a large part of the harvest without spending a single extra dollar. But watering is only part of the story, because the next mistake is even more common and quietly steals tomatoes long before the fruits have a chance to ripen. The second mistake is one that hides in plain sight, because your tomato plants often look healthy while the real problem is happening underneath them. I learned this lesson many years ago when I could never understand why some plants grew fast in the beginning and then suddenly slowed down just when they should have been filling with tomatoes. The leaves were still green enough and the stems looked strong, but the harvest was always much smaller than I expected. An older man who had been growing tomatoes longer than I had been alive walked over one afternoon and asked me a simple question. He said, "When was the last time you looked at the soil instead of the plant?" That question stayed with me because I realized I spent all my time looking at the leaves and almost none looking at the ground. The soil around my tomatoes had become hard from watering and walking nearby. Every rain left a thin crust on top and the roots underneath were struggling to breathe. Most people never notice this because the change happens little by little until the plants simply stop growing with the same energy they had before. The old gardener showed me something so simple that I almost laughed when I first saw it. After every good rain or deep watering, he gently loosened only the top layer of soil with his fingers or a small hand tool. He never dug deep because tomato roots stay close to the surface and can be damaged easily. He only broke the hard crust so fresh air and water could move down where the roots needed them most. Then he covered the soil with a layer of dry grass straw or old leaves. That simple cover kept the ground cooler during hot afternoons, held moisture much longer, and stopped the hard crust from forming again. Today, many people spend money on expensive soil products while forgetting this old habit that costs almost nothing. I have followed that same method ever since, and every season I notice the difference. My tomatoes stay healthier during long dry spells, and the plants continue setting fruit when others nearby begin slowing down. Most gardeners think the secret is feeding the plant more, but very often the plant already has enough food. It simply cannot use it properly because the roots are struggling in tired, compacted soil. And once you understand that you are ready for the third mistake, which quietly steals even more tomatoes than poor watering or hard soil ever will. The third mistake is feeding tomato plants at the wrong time and with the wrong purpose. I used to believe that if a little fertilizer helped, then adding more would help even more. At first, everything looked wonderful because the plants became tall, thick, and covered with large, dark green leaves. Anyone walking through the garden would probably say those were the healthiest tomatoes around. Then summer moved on and I started wondering where all the tomatoes were. There were plenty of leaves, but not nearly enough fruit. That was when another experienced gardener explained something that changed the way I grow tomatoes forever. He told me that a tomato plant can only put its energy into one main job at a time. If you keep pushing it to grow leaves, it will happily keep making leaves while delaying the fruit that you have been waiting for all season. From that day forward, I stopped trying to make the biggest plant and started trying to make the happiest plant. One old method that has stayed with me is using well-finished compost as the main source of nutrition instead of constantly reaching for strong fertilizers. Good compost feeds the soil little by little, and the roots take what they need without being forced into fast leafy growth. I also learned that wood ash from clean untreated firewood can be useful in small amounts around tomatoes, because many old gardeners valued it for supporting healthy fruit development. They never poured on large piles. They simply used a light handful and mixed it gently into the soil. Very few people still do this today because they think the answer must come from an expensive bag at the garden center. Sometimes the older methods are slower, but they are also steadier and much easier on the plants. Another habit that helped me was removing only the unnecessary lower leaves once the plants became larger. This improved the airflow around the stems and helped keep moisture from sitting close to the ground where problems often begin. I never stripped the plants bare because every healthy leaf is still helping produce energy for the fruit. The goal is balance, not perfection. That lesson took me years to understand. Once I stopped chasing huge leafy plants, my harvest became larger than ever before. But there is another mistake that quietly costs people even more tomatoes because it happens while the fruits are already growing, and many gardeners never notice it until it is far too late. The fourth mistake usually happens when the first healthy tomatoes finally begin to appear and people think the hard work is already finished. I used to feel the same way. I would walk through the garden smiling because I could see dozens of small green tomatoes hanging from every plant. I believed nothing could go wrong after that. Then one hot week would arrive and suddenly some tomatoes would split open while others would develop dark spots on the bottom or simply stop getting bigger. I blamed the weather for years until an older grower told me that the weather was only part of the story. The real problem was that I was letting my tomato plants go through constant changes instead of giving them steady conditions. Tomatoes do not like surprises. They do much better when the soil stays evenly moist and the roots can work at the same pace every day. One forgotten habit that helped me more than almost anything else was keeping a simple layer of mulch around every plant from early summer until the last harvest. I never worried about making it look perfect. Sometimes I used dry grass that had never been treated with chemicals. Other times I used straw or shredded leaves collected the previous autumn. That simple cover protected the soil from the hot sun, kept moisture from disappearing too quickly, and reduced the number of weeds stealing water from the tomatoes. Very few people still have the patience to do this because it seems too simple to matter, but every season it reminds me why the older gardeners relied on it. Another mistake that many people make is leaving damaged or overripe tomatoes on the plant for too long. Once I started checking my plants every morning and removing ripe fruit as soon as it was ready, the plants seemed to keep producing with much more energy. It only takes a few minutes, but that regular harvest encourages the plant to continue setting new flowers instead of putting all its strength into fruit that is already finished growing. I also learned never to ignore the first yellow leaf or the first damaged branch. Small problems are always easier to remove than large ones. A few quiet minutes in the garden each day often save hours of work later in the season. These little habits may not seem exciting, but together they protect a surprising amount of the harvest. And there is still one final mistake that I believe costs more tomatoes than all the others because it begins long before people even realize they are making it. The fifth mistake is expecting tomato plants to take care of themselves once they become large. I understand why people think that way because by the middle of summer the plants look strong and full of life. They are taller than ever and loaded with leaves and fruit, so it feels like the difficult part is already behind you. That is exactly what I believed for many years, and it quietly cost me more tomatoes than I ever realized. The truth is that this is the time when your plants need your attention the most. Not hours of hard work, but a few careful minutes every day. I like to walk through my garden early in the morning while everything is still quiet. I look under the leaves instead of only looking at the fruit. I check the stems. I notice whether the flowers are opening well and whether the newest leaves look healthy. Most people only notice a problem after it has already spread across half the plant. The older gardeners who taught me never waited that long. They believed that the first small sign was the easiest time to solve almost any problem. One loose branch was tied before it broke. One damaged leaf was removed before it affected the others. One tomato with a crack was picked before insects found it. These little habits seem almost too simple to matter, but together they protect a surprising amount of the harvest. I also learned not to become impatient near the end of the season. Many people stop caring for their tomatoes as soon as they have picked a few good baskets. They water less often, they stop checking the plants, and they leave fruit hanging much longer than necessary. Yet those final weeks can produce some of the sweetest tomatoes of the entire summer if the plants remain healthy. Another forgotten habit that an old neighbor showed me was removing any new flowers that appeared very late in the season when there was no realistic chance for them to become ripe fruit. At first, I thought it made no sense, but he explained that the plant would stop wasting energy on flowers that would never mature and instead direct more strength toward the tomatoes already growing. I have followed that advice ever since, and it has never disappointed me. Gardening has taught me that a large harvest rarely comes from one magical trick. It comes from many small decisions repeated patiently week after week. And when all of those simple habits come together, the difference at harvest time is something that surprises even experienced gardeners. There is just one final thing I want to leave you with, because it completely changed the way I think about growing tomatoes, and I believe it may change the way you see your own garden as well. When I look back over all the years I have spent growing tomatoes, I realize that the biggest changes never came from buying better tools or spending more money. They came from slowing down, paying closer attention, and trusting the simple methods that experienced gardeners passed from one person to another. Every season teaches us something new, but these 5 mistakes keep returning because they seem so harmless at first. Watering too often, but too shallow. Forgetting that healthy soil is just as important as healthy leaves. Feeding the plant to grow foliage instead of fruit. Ignoring the value of steady moisture and regular harvesting. Believing that large plants no longer need careful attention. None of these mistakes look serious on a single day, but together they quietly steal basket after basket of tomatoes before the season is over. The wonderful part is that every one of them can be corrected without filling your shed with expensive products. A little compost, some mulch, careful watering patience, and a few peaceful minutes with your plants each morning can often do far more than another bottle from the garden store. That is why I still enjoy growing tomatoes after all these years. Every harvest reminds me that nature usually rewards simple, steady habits instead of complicated solutions. If you decide to follow even 1 or 2 of the ideas we talked about today, I believe you will notice the difference before this season is over. Your plants will stay stronger through the hot weeks, your fruits will ripen more evenly, and picking tomatoes will become something you look forward to instead of worrying about. I truly hope this video saves you from losing part of your harvest, because nothing feels better than carrying a basket full of tomatoes that you grew with your own hands. And once you discover how much difference these small changes can make, you may start looking at every part of your garden with fresh eyes, because there are many more old, forgotten methods that still work just as well today as they did many years ago. In our next video, I want to show you another simple technique that many older gardeners quietly used every season to keep tomato plants producing longer than most people think is possible. I think that lesson may surprise you even more than the 5 mistakes we discussed today.